And what's your pleasure?
The excitement and the lore of the auction block. This is Auction Waves, and I'm Elizabeth McLeod.
32,500, 100,000 there. Players all over the house. 400,000 on this rare piece, and 600,000, 900,000, 1 million, 1,175 once, 100,175 twice. We all good? Sold.
Welcome to Auction Waves, an exclusive audio presentation of Thomaston Place Auction Galleries. A piece of artwork hanging on your wall is never just a painting, just a photograph, just a print. It's an image that on whatever level spoke to you. And what it had to say often relates to how it came to be. The 2nd of May will offer collectors the world over a selection of over 500 unique and outstanding items spanning 5 centuries of history in our auction of Japanese art and antiques. Included in this auction will be many fine specimens demonstrating Japan's mastery of the art of the woodblock print. In a moment, we'll visit with a noted expert in this field. But first, the latest auction news. There's a lot going on in May at the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries and also at Vintage Accents Mid-Coast Affordable Auctions, our sister company. Even as we process the winning bids and ship out items to their new owners at the conclusion of the May 2nd Japanese Art and Antiques Auction, we'll be shifting into high gear as preparations ramp up for our signature Summer Splendor Auction, June 27th through June 30th. 3 big days spanning an entire weekend of rare and beautiful items gathered from all over the world, carefully curated for your discerning bids. Choice items from important estates and private collections will be on the block for this event, so follow Thomaston Place Auction Galleries on your favorite social media, sign up for email alerts, and watch our website at thomastonauction.com. And of course, be sure to follow future editions of Auction Waves. Meanwhile, over at Vintage Accents Mid-Coast Affordable Auctions, Wednesday, May 14th, sees another collection of nearly 300 items on the block, including 19th and 20th century furniture and decor, artwork, and plenty of interesting collectibles, including a remarkable ancient Egyptian burial figure, 5 inches tall, complete with painted hieroglyphic inscriptions mounted on a museum-style display stand. That's just one of the many wonderful items to see in all our auctions. So keep up to the minute on the latest listings at thomastonauction.com and vintageaccents.com. You're listening to Auction Waves from the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries. I'm Elizabeth McLeod. For many collectors of Japanese art and antiques, few items offer a more rewarding pursuit than exploring the centuries-long heritage of the woodblock print. These fragile products of collaboration between artist and artisans capture the imagination while offering endless variety. An authority on the art and the passion of the Japanese woodblock print is David Kutcher of Moonlit Sea Prints, who joins us now from his gallery in Easthampton, Massachusetts. So to begin, perhaps give us a bit of background about yourself and how it was that you came to discover the exciting world of Japanese woodblock art.
I have a degree in fine art from Hamilton College, and I focused on printmaking. But what was interesting was I never did woodblock printmaking, and frankly, it wasn't even on my radar. Fast forward a few years later, I was living in Manhattan, lived on the Upper East Side, had an awful day at work. And when I was walking home, I stumbled into a Japanese art gallery. Didn't know what I was looking at. Ended up falling in love with a print. I learned that it was by an artist named Yoshimune, that it was part of a series called Hasegawa's Night Scenes. And every once in a while, I would go on eBay or search the web, and I would find another print from the series. And that's how I started collecting, was that one series, Hasegawa's Night Scenes. And then fast forward years later, I thought, 6 months into the pandemic, I don't know, now's a good time to start another business. And I ended up forming Moonlit Prints, Japanese art gallery.
Now, we know that woodblock printing came to Japan via China, and a lot of it, when it first began to appear in Japan, was of a religious or maybe even a utilitarian nature. But with the rise of the Edo period in the 17th century, you started to see the rise of woodblock printing as a real artistic medium.
The change in woodblock printmaking came about as a kind of part and parcel with the rise of the middle class and people having money to spend. And when they had money to spend, they wanted decoration and they wanted to travel. So those two things kind of collided. Many of the early Japanese woodblock prints that people fall in love with are landscape scenes because that's how people learned about where they should go and what they should see. But before that time, nobody really had, there wasn't enough of a middle class to have money to spend to have art like this. So a lot of those early scenes were either landscape prints, prints of beautiful women. You would have early shunga, which are the risque pictures. It became an art form that was very accessible to those who are now having money to spend.
So these prints were not luxury items. They were not expensive at all.
And that was kind of the beauty of it, is that it kind of, I mean, I hate to say it, but it democratized the art of the time. Painting was still considered the high art, whereas printmaking was considered the working person's art. You could be buying original Hiroshiges for $1 or $2. You know, there were prints. In the same way that in Western art, prints were the affordable alternative to original paintings, as opposed to a high art for nobles only.
Now, did those not large but not small editions remain consistent through the history of the medium, or as techniques evolved, were they able to produce in greater numbers?
So in Western art and art collecting, we're familiar with the concept of edition sizes and numbered editions. That wasn't really a concept in Japanese woodblock printmaking until the early 20th century. We'll never really know how many printings were done of Hakusai's works or Hiroshige's works. We'll never know because they didn't record it. They just printed them. And as far as I'm aware, they didn't keep track of numbers at all. They're just like, oh, we need to make more, so we'll print more. Or this design isn't selling nearly as much as this design, so there might only be 50 of one design and 600 of a different design from the same series, just because the market wasn't there. And I say 600, 600 is actually a large edition for the time. Considering how much time goes into the production of these, you might see 200 to 400, 500 at the most of a print during that time, just because the amount of investment was pretty hefty.
I want to talk a little bit about the technique. If you look at a print, it is sometimes difficult to distinguish it from a painting. The work is done with such precision. How did they manufacture the blocks? How did they pull the prints? How did they keep everything in alignment? It seems like an awfully sophisticated medium to be done with such primitive tools.
I mean, that's the thing, is that we're talking about incredibly skilled craftsmen. And it's probably a really good thing that it was done as, I like to say it, as a team sport. It allowed the person who's in charge of the carving to be a master craftsman at their job. It allowed the person who is doing the actual printing to be a master craftsman at their job. Those craftsmen don't receive nearly as much attention and scholarship and credit as they will probably do. With these prints, you're talking about really hard cherry wood, expensive wood, because you had to have a block that was wide enough at the time for the trunk of the tree to be wide enough to make these blocks. And then you're talking about incredibly detailed, sharp chisels and tools in order to get these incredibly fine lines into this hard wood. So that even when you've carved, let's say, anywhere from 10 block sets to 50 block sets, we're talking about like incredible detail that goes into these. And the printer isn't just like, okay, here's one color blue that I'm just going to slap on the block and print that, but also doing gradients and gradations on the blocks themselves to get these beautiful sunrises and sunsets, to layer in ambiance that is so nuanced and that they're able to replicate it over an edition of 200 prints, where you can look at 5 of these prints and they might be exact in their details. It's a masterclass in really perfecting an art form, and they took it very seriously. And that's not to say that there aren't nuances and changes over time. I've had in my studio 2 copies of a print by Shotai, and it looks like on one day they ran out of yellow, so they just use orange instead. So like you will get nuances, and those nuances are incredibly fun to discover and document. But still, it is pretty remarkable to see how sophisticated they were in their craft.
Were they purely intended as decorative art, or did the producers of these prints ever use them to tell stories or comment on political or social movements that were going on at the time?
A little bit of everything. Artists like Kiyosai Kawanabe, who did a lot of political satire. He was often jailed for his political satire. You would have stories that were told. I have on my wall over here, I have some kuniyoshis that were part of a series of the Kisakaido Road series by Kuniyoshi, where he coupled the landscape with stories that would be familiar to the Japanese audience, whether they were legends or tales of famous battles or all kinds of things. One of the most popular is the tale of Genji. So I think just about every major artist of the 19th century did at least one series on the tale of Genji. You would have them for kabuki theater. Artists would be hired to do essentially just like we would do posters for Broadway shows in Times Square. They would be hired to do posters advertising the current kabuki theater performances that are out there, all numbers of things that are out there.
I have seen some assertions that Japanese prints in some ways were even an ancestor of sequential art, which is, of course, the fancy name for a comic strip. And I from what you're saying, they could have been used in that way.
Yeah, where my gallery is, down the hall from me is one of the largest comic book dealers in the country. And we've thought about doing a show to showcase how manga, which comes from Hakusai's manga, basically has carried through for 200 years to today's modern comic books. We can look at figure drawings by the artist Yoshitoshi and how he studies musculature and how he contorts the body. And in his woodblock prints and his drawings and imagery, you can almost see like a direct line of ascension to today's Spider-Man comic books. There is this line of comic book art that comes directly from Japanese art. So when we have gallery events, kids will come in here and they'll pick up pieces because they're so familiar with their manga and anime. They are fascinated when they realize that these are 200 to 300-year-old pieces of art, and yet feel still really relevant to them in what they currently love to read and look at.
The emotional punch transcends the centuries. I want to talk about some of the political and cultural changes in Japan during the golden era of printmaking. Up until the middle of the 19th century, of course, Japan was largely a closed society as far as the West was concerned. There was some limited trade, but not very much. But when Japan was opened to the West in the middle of the 19th century, how did that cause woodblock printing and the printmaking industry to evolve with the times? Did the West pick up an interest in these works at that time?
So the West fell in love with Japanese art, and the Japanese fell in love with Western art. It's kind of fun to see transitions between, like, after Japan was open to the West, how they started learning Western figure drawing and Western perspective drawing. And suddenly there's this like 20 years of incredible change in the art form, not just in woodblock printmaking, but in Japanese art, because like I said, perspective changed, figure drawing changed, and lots of other things changed as well. The color palettes changed, all of that changed. At the same time, Westerners fell in love with Japanese art. I have in the gallery the collection book from one of the largest Japanese art exhibitions that had been held, that was first held in France, I think in the 1860s, 1870s, somewhere around there. But it was when Japanese art, not just printmaking, but all of it was introduced to Europe. And this is the show that Cézanne went to, Van Gogh went to, all the Impressionists went there and fell in love with Japanese art. And you can start seeing that influence in their own art. So the influences went both ways. And we talked earlier about how this was kind of like low art or working class art. So when pottery was being imported, expensive pottery was being imported into Europe, it would come in these boxes, these nice little wooden boxes, and it would be wrapped up in woodblock prints. So they were using it as wrapping paper. So if you were an artist, you were unpacking this piece of pottery and you were opening up the wrapping paper and going, oh my goodness, what is this? And that's how Westerners became introduced in many ways to Japanese woodblock prints, because it was just wrapping paper.
Did the publishers of the prints catch on to this new market right away? Did they start manufacturing specifically for export?
I don't think they necessarily became manufacturing for export until Watanabe in the early 20th century. He was really, I think, the marketer behind looking at Japanese art for export. He did things like we would have numbered editions. He had market differentiation. So when he went and hired artists for his publishing company, he would say, okay, you're amazing at pictures of beautiful women. That's your job. That's your market. And you're great at landscapes. So you're my landscape person. And you're my portrait person. And you're my birds and flowers person. As a business person, I find that fascinating. But he really, I think, cognizantly thought about, how can I sell this to the West?
Sort of the rise of the Shinhaga movement at that time.
It was Watanabe. It was T. Hasagawa Publishing Company. It was another one. They were more of a book publisher who also did prints. But the same thing, like they really were looking at the United States and Europe as major markets. So they were externally facing as opposed to really dedicating themselves to the Japanese market itself.
So we have a print in our current auction, lot number 1164. It's Hasui by Kawase Hasui, Nisaka on Tokaido Road. It's one of his most notable images. And as you were talking about earlier, the discovery of perspective and shadow and the incorporation of that into the motifs, I really noticed that difference in this compared to the earlier prints. It was definitely not something that would have been done 100 years earlier. Talk to me a bit about Hasui. He seems like one of the most important figures in that 20th century movement.
He's definitely a very important figure, and he's probably the most known figure of the 20th century in Shinhaga. You know, just like Hakusai is the 19th century person. Hasui is definitely becoming, and it has maybe always been, for the mid 20th century. And his work is amazing. You know, both it's fun seeing his artistry, his personal artistry through his watercolors, because from a process perspective, almost all of these artists were trained as painters first and foremost. And the way that they sketched was almost always using watercolor as their sketching medium. So you would be able to see, you know, their work product. And then they would take the watercolor to their publisher, who would then work with the carver and the inker to make the woodblock print. But with that, I'm going in a few different directions, so bear with me. Watanabe was a nationalist who was also wanted to hold on to traditional Japanese values. And during this time of the quick modernization of Japan, there were kind of two warring camps within Japan. One that was like, let's wholly embrace the Western everything. And the other was, but we need to hold on to what makes us Japanese and Japanese values and Japanese perspectives and how we see the world. Watanabe was really into putting out artwork and publishing artwork that I think held to this Japanese ideal or ideal Japan that he wanted to sell to the West. So within Hasui's work, and it's easy to see them because it's so incredible, is you'll get these great perspectives that often have moments of solitude and quiet reflection. And even though there might be some Western modernization, you can definitely see a Japan that's holding on to, I'm going to say Zen, but I don't mean it that way, but like a Zen stillness and resolve.
I find a certain melancholia in some of these images. There's sort of almost an isolation, a loneliness being expressed.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it ties into that battle of Japan kind of figuring out its identity in the early 20th century as it was modernizing and as it was trying to both maintain its Japanese character, but also looking at the Westerners and wanting to be Western as well. I think there's only like a handful of prints where by Hasui where you would see cars. He kind of avoids the modernism of the time to kind of focus on, well, what makes us Japanese and what are the things that we identify with as kind of a showcasing their view and image of Japan to the West.
And he was very popular in the United States during the 1930s. There were shows and exhibits in New York. He was written about in fashionable magazines of the time. And then the war came. What did the war do to the printmaking industry and to artists like Hasui?
The printmaking industry almost died in the late 1800s. So printmakers were going out of business left and right. Publishers were going out of business. The artists weren't making much money. They found kind of a little bit of relief when they were hired to do prints for the Sino-Japanese Wars. So why we call it Shinhanga as new prints is that Watanabe kind of revitalized the printmaking industry. Now, going into World War II, there was shortages of paper and those types of things. The government really held back in allowing these publishers to do art. And at the same time, there was a pushback against anything Japanese in the West. That kind of changed after World War II, because now you had all these GIs that were stationed in Japan who were buying up everything they could for pennies on the dollar. And I think that kicked off another second craze of fascination with Japanese art and Hasui.
Now, this particular print that we have here has a Watanabe publisher's seal that, according to the list on your website, which I found very informative, appears to be from the 1946-57 era, which would make it a lifetime print for Hasui, who died in, I think, 1957. It appears to be signed in English script in the Japanese fashion with the surname before the given name. Would this perhaps be Hasui's personal signature?
No, unfortunately not. So the signatures were almost always applied by the publishing house. That's not the case for all artists. I want to be very clear that this is because, again, Westerners, we're looking for numbered prints, we're looking for hand signatures, we're looking for those types of things. And they knew that, so they would have the person scribble on the signature and send it out.
I noticed the same handwriting on a number of other prints that I found images for online. It was clearly the same hand. So
yep, it was definitely the person working in the office. I don't think he ever hand signed any of his prints, as far as I'm aware.
An export item, definitely.
Yes, most definitely an export item. But that's not the case for all artists. So, for example, Hiroshi Yoshida was a contemporary, but who self-carved and self-printed and owned his own printing studio. When he did his own pieces, he would do a separate seal that was in the margin called a Jizuri seal that said, basically, I made this. And he would pencil sign his signature, but then for his pieces that were done posthumously, there was a block that was made that was of his signature. So it was signed on the plate, essentially, and stamped into the print. So you'll see some that are pencil signed that are actually his signature because, like I said, he published his own, but then others that were after he was dead where his signature was applied to the print. It depends on the artist, but for the most part, the pencil signatures during this time were applied by the publishing company.
Now, you mentioned that he produces his own prints from the point of engraving the plates to pulling the ink, doing the whole thing. Is that sort of a trend now in Japanese printmaking to make it more of an artisanal individual craft than a collaborative effort?
So there were two movements within printmaking that kind of started in the early 20th century. One is Shinhanga, which is new prints, which followed the team model of publishing. And the other was Susakahanga, which was the self-carved, self-made movement. In most cases, they didn't overlap. An artist was generally either in one camp or the other camp. There were crossover artists, like, for example, Kazumatsu Shira, who was actually an artist in the Watanabe publishing camp. But then after World War II, I think Kazumatsu Shira kind of gave up on that idea and wanted to go out on his own. And in the 50s, he started self-carving and self-printing his own pieces. And when he did that, he also did numbered editions. So he kind of changed from the Shinhanga to Susakahanga and then changed again with the numbered editions and things like that. What makes me laugh, and I'm a huge fan of Kazumatsu Shira's work, is that he kind of cheats in his numbering systems. And I say that because I've been researching a ton about his work. And it's funny because you'll find two copies maybe of the same print from the first edition. And on one, you'll see that it's number 11 out of 50, first edition. And on the other one, you'll see number 60 out of 100 of the first edition. So he changed his edition sizes kind of halfway through the edition, which just makes me laugh. Even when there's editions, they kind of fudge with them occasionally. But I'm digressing. I would say now there are still publishing companies and artists who work with publishing companies to do things in the Shahanga style. But I think most of them, majority of Japanese printmakers are going Susakahanga style in that they want to have complete control of their artistic vision and output.
So if a new collector today is stimulated by this conversation that we're having and decides to try to get into fine Japanese prints, what are going to be the challenges that they face? What are the important considerations that they're going to have to think about? How would they really get started?
I would say find a piece that you love, and before you buy it, research it. There's more and more so there's becoming better scholarship. Through Google searches, you can find lots of scholarship on many of these pieces. So find the artist or find a print that you like, that you fall in love with first, like I did with Hasegawa's Night Scenes, and let it take you down rabbit holes.
Thank you, David, for your time, and thank you for giving us all the information that you have given us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to David Kutcher of Moonlit Sea Prints for joining us today. And if you want to know more about the many fascinating nuances of the art and history of the Japanese woodblock print, you'll find plenty of resources to start you along that path in the research library section of David's website, moonlitseaprints.com. And if you're down his way, his gallery is located in the Eastworks, 116 Pleasant Street, Suite 226 in Easthampton, Massachusetts. He's open by appointment Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. And you can reach him by email at david@moonlitseaprints.com. And that sound means it's already time for me to take my leave, but not before one last reminder to make your plans now to bid in our auction of Japanese art and antiques, taking place live at the gallery with Kaja Veyu at the podium, starting at 10 a.m. sharp on Friday, May 2nd. You'll have a chance to preview items from this auction at the gallery, 51 Atlantic Highway in Thomaston on Tuesday through Thursday, April 29th through May 1st, from 10 a.m. till 4. Tishri Dobson is at the piano for you today. David Allen on the guitar. The program is written, directed, and edited by yours truly, Elizabeth McLeod. Wishing you all smooth sailing and happy bidding for Auction Waves. Auction Waves is an exclusive audio presentation of the Thomaston Place Auction Galleries in Thomaston, Maine.